This book has been extremely difficult to write in my personal circumstances, and Stuart was just so sensitive about that. And then when the moment came to drive me on, then he drove me on like an editor should drive the author on, and one draft followed another, and I was hoping Stuart would say to me, "You've got it," but no. So sort of, I think it was 4 drafts eventually. Stuart sort of gave me a nod, and that's exactly what an editor should do, and thank you so much for everything you've done. It's been, the book would not be nearly as good as it is. Well, it wouldn't, however good, would not be what it is without you. Thank you very much. Okay, let's start here. These are Goldman Sachs GDP projections for 2025 and 2050. Concentrate on the upper chart first, because if you're not familiar with the figures, they're very dramatic. You will see, if this works, if it doesn't, then it doesn't matter. But you'll see that China is almost the same size as the United States economy not long from now, and projected to overtake the American economy in size in 2027. Cast your eye below. This is 2050, 40 years hence. That's a long time, of course. But the Chinese economy is almost twice the size of the American economy. And the Indian economy is almost as big as the American economy. And you'll see that only 2 European countries nudge into the top 10, the UK and Germany, with economies like Indonesia and Brazil and Mexico significantly larger. We are moving into a new and very different era in which the traditional rich world is declining and the developing world is on the rise. In 1973, the rich world accounted for 2/3 of global GDP. Today, it's more like half. Once it was the G7, now it's the G20. And this reflects not just a shift in economic power, but the emergence, I argue, of new modernities. There's been a widespread assumption that all countries, whatever they are, wherever they come from, are heading in the same direction, for the same destination. Namely, they will be Western-style societies. In other words, there's just one kind of modernity, and it's ours. Now, I argue that this is quite wrong. Modernity is not just shaped by markets and technology, but also by history and culture. We are witnessing, in this era, the birth of new modernities with very different coordinates to those of the West. We are entering, as I argue in the book, the era of contested modernity. Now, we already have examples of this to hand. If we look at Japan, really, it's clear with Japan, and has been clear for a long time vis-à-vis Japan. It's also clear, although less clear, if you like, because they're much smaller, with the Asian tigers. But it is China, because of its sheer size and its highly distinctive history, that will unambiguously demonstrate that its modernity will be profoundly different from that of the West. Now, hitherto, the rise of China has been overwhelmingly seen in economic terms. And likewise, its impact has been really only discussed in economic terms. But I argue that its political and cultural impact will be just as great. The rise of China will transform the world as we have known it, and make it over time unfamiliar to Westerners who are habituated to regarding the world as essentially Western. Now, tonight I just want to give 4 illustrations of ways in which I think China will remain fundamentally different from the West, even becoming more different in some senses, and will thereby change the world as we know it. Firstly, civilization state. Now, for the last century, China has described itself and adapted to the norms of being a nation state. But this is not really what China is. China is the world's longest running polity, dating certainly from the Qin dynasty, 221 BC. And you'll see already the real population heartlands of China, which are situated in this eastern and central area, were united after the Warring State period. The dynasty that followed the Qin were the Han. And you can see already that actually the Han Empire is not so far short of the Ming dynasty of much later, before the great expansion of the Qing dynasty into the western parts of China. Now, until 1900, China was not a nation state. It was a civilization state. It saw itself as a civilization state. And the Chinese still essentially think of themselves not in terms of being a nation, but in terms of being a civilization. It won't be long if you talk to any Chinese, whether it's a taxi driver or some highfalutin intellectual, and they'll tell you that their civilization is 5,000 years old. And all the key characteristics that define a sense of Chineseness are civilizational rather than the last century. Confucian ethos, distinctive social relations, Guanxi, state, the nature of the state, the role of the state, the ideographic language, the very specific nature of the Chinese family, ancestral worship. All of these things are fundamental. You could add Chinese food and Chinese medicine as well. You could go on. Are all products of Chinese period of a civilization state. So the Chinese sense of identity, very different from Europe, predates being a nation state. The nation state is, if you like, the topsoil, and the geological formation is that of a civilization state. You also, in this context, must bear in mind, talking about a civilization state, the sheer scale and diversity of China. I don't know whether you can read this. I hope you can. But just two illustrations of this. Look, population scale. Each of the colored provinces, both green and blue, is as large in population as the UK, or larger. Just those 4 provinces colored in blue to the east are larger than the population of the United States. So this gives some idea of just the sheer scale of China, or the diversity in terms of GDP per head. Shanghai is the richest area with a population of something like 20 million odd, and then Gansu, which has got these are in RMB, 51,000 roughly, 51,500, about 5,500 pounds. This was 2005 figures, and Gansu, I can't even read it here. 7,500. So China is very diverse and much more decentralized than we think of in the West. We have a view of China, of course, as being, single identity, rather monolithic, associated with the present communist regime to some extent, and so on. But it would not be possible to rule such a vast country, to govern such a vast country like that. It's extremely decentralized in the manner of its operation. Now, what are the implications of being a civilization state for the way in which China works? I want to make 3 points. Firstly, it has a very different kind of politics from a conventional nation state, with a notion of unity, or an attachment to unity, rooted in the notion of civilization rather than nation, at the heart of what the priority of a Chinese government is. This has been true right the way through, from the imperial period through to the present communist period. Secondly, a civilization state embodies and allows a plurality of systems that is quite alien to a nation state. Let me give you 2 examples. Remember 1997, the handover of Hong Kong. One country, two systems. One country, two systems. Can you imagine a nation state suggesting a solution, one country, two systems? With a nation state, it is one nation, one system. But you cannot govern a continent which is a civilization in that kind of way. There is immense diversity. Or take the 1978 reform period embarked on by Deng Xiaoping. It started with the special economic zones in Fujian province, in Guangdong, and so on. These were of huge implication. These were changing the whole way in which China was going to work. But they were introduced in a small part of the country because that is what can be achieved and needs to be done in a civilization state. And the third point I want to make in terms of the implications of being a civilization state is the way in which history is seen. History has an intimacy and a role and a relevance for the present that is extremely unusual in a nation state. Not just near history, but far history, distant history, the history of ancient dynasties. The language of a lot of contemporary discourse in China is an historical language. Again, not just for the intellectuals, but just as much for ordinary people. And that, again, I think is a characteristic of China as a civilization state. Now, I would argue that as China becomes increasingly self-confident, it will increasingly be what it feels itself to be, a civilization state rather than a nation state. And as the most powerful country in the world to be, the global state system will change profoundly as a consequence, because the top dog in the world will not be a conventional nation state, but will be a civilization state. My second example concerns the tributary state system. Now, here we have a map of East Asia and a bit more South Asia. But what we're concerned with here is China, Korea, where's Korea gone? Japan, and reaching into Southeast Asia, or certainly to Vietnam, Thailand, and right the way down here. Now, for thousands of years, literally thousands of years, this region of the world was organized into a tributary state system, at the heart of which was China. Not a nation-state system, but a tributary state system. What were its characteristics? First, enormous economic inequality between China and the neighboring states and kingdoms. Secondly, huge Chinese cultural influence and an acceptance by its neighbors of Chinese cultural superiority. The Chinese have a very hierarchical view of relationships and still do. Thirdly, that in return for forms of protection and support, these kingdoms would pay tribute to the emperor. Fourthly, the system was very loose and very diverse. So depending on particularly your nearness to Beijing, or whatever the capital was at the time, would be the way in which the relationship worked. So you had big brothers and little brothers, and it was all done in a sort of Confucian language of the family. And fifthly, the final characteristic I want to mention is longevity and extraordinary stability. Now, probably, arguably, the tributary state system in terms of attitudes has never gone away. I mean, we're talking about 100 years compared with something that lasted for thousands of years, both on the Chinese side in terms of their attitudes and on the neighboring state side. And I give some illustrations in the book. Now, look what is happening. This is a most extraordinary change. These are the countries in the region. We're talking about the Chinese market, its importance for all these countries, the countries I've listed here, in the region. And in a very short space of time, 12 years, and I can tell you now that it's continued apace since, there's been a dramatic increase in the importance of the Chinese market for every single country here listed. and it will, for some, China is already the most important market. For others, probably for every country in East Asia, it will become the most important single market. And of course, there's some particularly dramatic transformations. Korea has gone from, in this period, went from 0 to about 17%. Taiwan, look at that, from 0, I can tell you now this figure is 40%. So what's happening with great speed is the growing importance of China means that the East Asian economy is being reconfigured around China. It's becoming China-centric. Now, you might think, okay, this is a long way away, blah, 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 blah. Well, first of all, I think East Asia prefigures the future to some extent in terms of Chinese influence. And secondly, remember, East Asia is the biggest economic region in the world. It's bigger than North America, and it's bigger than Europe. Now, what I think this means is, in a sense, we're seeing the re-emergence of the conditions that underpin the tributary state system. I mean, what blew it away, essentially, was the arrival of Europe and European colonialism. Well, Europe exited, had gone by the 1950s from East Asia, replaced by the United States. But actually, one of the dramatic features of the Bush period has been the decline of the United States' influence in East Asia. And, of course, the other condition is the rise of China. So I don't think we should be surprised if East Asia resumes some of the characteristics of the tributary state period. China hugely disproportionate in power and strength, that is certainly going to happen. Increasing dependency of other countries on it, you can see that here already. Implicit recognition of Chinese culture, the value of Chinese culture, even the superiority of Chinese culture. Actually, in some ways, that never went away. And you can add not only to the traditional countries that were involved in the tributary state system, something that didn't exist in that period, but if you want to get a sign of the times, it's Australia. The shift in Australia to an increasingly China focus is a very interesting phenomenon. Now, will this kind of notion spread further with the rise of China? I don't know. Central Asia, definitely a possibility. Should we be thinking in these terms when we think about Africa? I mean, now we always use Western terms, colonialism and so on, but maybe we should think, we should consider this as well. Okay. My third point concerns the Chinese attitude towards race. Now, China has a population of 1.4 billion people, huge. Around 92% of the population consider themselves to be Han Chinese. Now, this is entirely different from the other most populous countries in the world. India, the United States, Indonesia, Brazil, all of which are and consider themselves to be multiracial. Now, of course, it's nonsense that there's 92% of the Chinese are one race, but that is how they think. It's obvious if you go to cities like Shanghai and Beijing, even Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou, you can see very powerful physical differences. But that is not how the Chinese see it. Why? Well, first of all, it's really back to a civilizational point. Such a long history, such a long process of mixing and melding based on incorporation, conquest, assimilation, and so on, has meant that a Chinese identity has been forged over a very, very long period of time. This is very in contrast, for example, to India, which has a much shorter history as India as we know it today. The result of this is that other identities, by the way, are much weaker compared with India, for example. Much, much weaker. The strong identity is, the provinces do not have a strong identity. It's very, very different from the Indian example. Secondly, there's a widespread belief in China, as there is in Japan, by the way, in polygenism. In other words, that the Chinese are separately descended from all other branches of the human race. They do not share the view, on the whole, that all humanity is descended from Africa. The Chinese, in other words, are separately descended and therefore biologically different. Thirdly, a notion of the Chinese of the Han Chinese has long underpinned the unity of the notion of the unity of the civilization state and vice versa. And finally, but only very recently, you had, towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, as the imperial regime began to break up, the arrival of a particularly kind of powerful racist way of thinking and discourse and articles and so on, which mirrored what was happening also in the West at the time. But that was much more recent, and that incidentally is when the term Han Chinese was also coined. It's a relatively recent term. Now, the result of this, I think, is that the difficulty of this for the rest of the world is that China does not recognize cultural difference. And this is very evident in the attitudes towards the Uyghurs, for example, in Xinjiang province, or the Tibetans. The Han Chinese attitude is essentially one of assimilation and a sort of civilizing mission of the Han Chinese to raise them up to the level of the Han Chinese. Now, as we know from our own experience of, for example, Britain, or for example, the United States, countries see the world, dominant countries see the world in terms of themselves and their own history. And so also China will. And I think that the lack of recognition of difference and a sense of cultural and racial difference and superiority of the Chinese will be one of the most problematic aspects of the arrival of Chinese ascendancy. My fourth and final point concerns the distinctiveness of the Chinese polity. The Chinese state is very different from Western states, the state in Western societies. Firstly, it's the embodiment and guardian of Chinese civilization. It represents it. And therefore, because of the sort of centrality of the notion of civilization to the Chinese, it's revered and deferred to in a way which is different from West. It's regarded as organic to the society in a way that I don't think the state is regarded in Western societies. And its overriding responsibility, as I said earlier, is to preserve the unity of China, of Chinese civilization. First point. Second point. The Chinese state, unlike the European state, for example, has had for a millennium no serious competitors. The European states were required to share power with the church, with merchants, with the nobility, and so on. Not true in China. Even to this day, not true. There are no boundaries, therefore, to its power. Whereas they're carefully delineated in Western societies, that has not been true, either the imperial period or the communist period in China. Another point, that by and large, fundamentally, the Chinese state does not deal with, and they never had to deal with other groups, whatever they are, merchants, for example, on the basis of negotiation and compromise, but on the basis that they seek individual favors. This is very, very clear in Hong Kong, for example, since the handover. Now, I think that none of these factors constitute a reason why China cannot become much more democratic. I don't accept that. But I think that it's very important for us to understand the specificity of different societies, of different cultures, in order to understand what the prospects are, or what the possibilities are, and how it's likely to be shaped. Now, there is actually in Chinese history a notion which is very powerful and much more democratic than the divine right of kings in the European tradition, which is the mandate of heaven. This notion was that if the emperor seemed to have failed, then he had lost his right to rule and could be overthrown. And this comes from Mencius and other very important writers in the Chinese tradition. And that is what happened. It was deemed, and there'd be great, huge popular uprisings. The Taiping uprising and so on are examples of this. So there are within the Chinese tradition all sorts of what I call sort of democratic elements. But I think it's very important for us to appreciate that Chinese democracy will have very Chinese characteristics, just like Japan has, but is not recognized because we think of it as a Western-style society. Wrong. Japan does not work like a Western-style society, and legitimacy and popular sovereignty does not rest in the same place as it does in Western societies. My final point about the state is just this. The Chinese state is a formidable institution. Not just now, but over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It has had capacities and abilities and skills that far exceeded at the time the level of capacity of Western states. And to this day, I think that the Chinese state is still a remarkable institution. It's had to reinvent itself. It did in 1949. To some extent, it did it in 1978 as well. Let me suggest to you that actually China is probably the home of statecraft, the home of state tradition. And I think that over time it will become something that will exercise, well, is already exercising a very big influence on developing countries, but I think will exercise a much wider influence. But it cannot be copied because it comes from a totally different historical roots. Now, I could go on this because there's lots of other things I'd really like to tell you about, but I won't, but I will just mention what they are. I mean, we obviously have to take into account that China is run by a communist party. Now, problem for us here, what happened, we all thought communism finished in 1989. Oh, but, you know, so what's all this about? You know, on the one hand, one of the most important events, closing in a sense the 20th century, as Eric Hobsbawm argued in Age of Extremes, and on the other hand, hang on a minute, 1978 to now, probably the most important transformation in the world, led by a communist party. There are some questions to think about here. China as a developed and a developing country. Look at this, look at this. This is going to be such a new phenomenon. This is the 2025 income per head. This is the situation in 2050. And look, even in, where's my little light gone? Even in, it doesn't want to work, okay, it doesn't matter. You can see it's colored in gold on the chart there. China, even in 2050, is still much, much poorer than the United States. So what does it mean? For the first time in modern history, since industrialization, the most important country in the world, the most powerful country in the world, will no longer be will no longer be both the biggest economy and also, in terms of GDP per head, the richest economy. Or what will it mean with China and India being the top dogs in the world, 38% of the world's population? What will it mean that they are on the wrong side, as far as the West was concerned, of the colonization experience? That is going to change, it seems to me, a lot. Okay. In conclusion, don't get too excited because the conclusion does last a bit. Rather than the cliches of globalization we've become accustomed to, westernization, Americanization, and so on, we are actually entering a quite new era, which is increasingly influenced and shaped by the developing countries. Now, what do I think about this? I think this is fantastic. In principle, this is fantastic. Why? Because the 200 years which have been associated with Western domination are the domination of a very small part of humanity. The global governance, in practice, the way it's worked, has been exercised by a very small minority of the world's population. That's what institutions like the G7 actually mean. That's what the IMF means in terms of voting capacity. Now we're moving into an era where just the arrival in China and India at the top table, you know, nearly 40% of the world's population. What this represents is the most important, rough and ready democratization globally that we have ever seen. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? It might be a very uncomfortable thing for us over time, but it seems to me that, you know, being on the side of humanity, this is a very positive development. Now, of course, at the center of this process is China. We might even talk of a process of sinification. Now, some aspects of this in conclusion. Economic. I just want to give you some glimpse of this. You saw the figures for 2050. Chinese economy twice the size of American economy. Okay. Look, June this month, latest figures on market, biggest companies in the world by market capitalization. We're just at the beginning of the process of the rise of China, and 3 Chinese companies in the top 5. Those are the ones colored gold. Or look at the growing importance of Chinese overinvestment. overseas investment. I mean, in 2002, sort of, you know, it was just $3 billion, and 2008, over 50. And Chinese overseas investment will come to absolutely dwarf American overseas investment. Most of this, by the way, now goes to East Asia. Over half goes to East Asia, followed by the developing world, and the West still only receives a very small amount. Or look at this. Okay, the IMF is one of the two great institutions of the Bretton Woods settlement of American economic hegemony and the American economic architecture for the world. And the IMF's usable resources pale into insignificance against Chinese reserves. Did you know that now Chinese loans and aid to Africa far exceeds anything dispensed by the World Bank? We are already moving into a different era, even though, you know, China's still at a relatively low level of development, but because of its scale of its population, it changed everything. Now, so that's the economic transformation. Or think about this. Beijing is probably going to be the new global capital, in effect. It'll be the new center in a way perhaps that New York has been for a large part of the 20th century. Shanghai will replace New York as the new financial center. The RMB, within 30 years, maybe less, will replace the dollar. And East Asia will, already the largest economic region in the world, will be hugely the most important economic region of the world. Maybe we'll witness the rise of Mandarin. It is largely assumed that English is here to stay as the global interlocutor language. Is that true? What will the decline of the United States mean for the position of English? After all, it's the rise of the United States which has largely been the reason why English has spread. I think language basically needs a sort of patron nation behind it. And you can see, oh, wait a minute. Sorry, look, I mean, this is the situation now. Mandarin is easily the most widely spoken language in the world as a first or second language. Twice as many people speak Mandarin as English. At the moment, of course, they're virtually all in China. But this is already changing. If you go to East Asia, Thailand, Korea, Mandarin is becoming a compulsory part of the school curriculum. Because you know, they need to speak Mandarin because China is becoming the central factor in East Asia. We will have to get used to new geopolitical ideas and concepts, a new vocabulary, civilization state, tributary state system, intertemporal law. Oh, I didn't do that one, never mind, doesn't matter. Look, this is, you know, there's a dispute over the islands in the South China Sea between countries like Malaysia and the Philippines and Vietnam and so on, over the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands and China. China claims all of the area within the red dotted line. That is the sort of historic claim line of China. The smaller countries base their claim on the territorial waters agreements which were pioneered by the United States after the Second World War. China based its claim on what it's called intertemporal law. In other words, law in historical context, if you like. So Hainan province, by the way, is the smallest province in China, but the largest in territory because it claims all that part of the South China Sea. One country, two systems. Get used to it. Imagine what the solution is going to be vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I'm fairly confident now that there will be, in not too long, some kind of solution. And it will be different again from what happened with Hong Kong. Much more flexible, much looser. Or the question of unity will become familiar to us in a different kind of way. You know, we now debate it in terms of Europe, but imagine the way we would think about it in terms of the Chinese experience. And of course, Confucian values. There will be new historical landmarks. Global history will increasingly cease to be a Western history. New dates will become familiar. 221 BC, the Sung Dynasty, Opium Wars, 1911, 1949, and of course, Zheng He's voyages between 1405 and 1433, including reaching the east coast of Africa. And there is his ship. Could you tell me whose ship that was, the little one? Any offers? Christopher Columbus. Well done. A plate of spring rolls for the gentleman at the back there. So there'll be new historical arguments. This is a silk scroll by Yuju, painted in 1368. Could you tell me what they're playing? Sorry? Golf. Golf. Who invented golf? Thank you very much.